Hello, I'm Chad Soares, a partner in our national office. Today we're talking about lease accounting, and specifically lease modifications and assessing the lease term. The FASB and the IASB have been working to conclude a long-standing project to revise lease accounting guidance. The proposals have not only prompted substantial comment from users and preparers, they also underscore the complex judgments that are required even today. One common example is the analysis required when a lessee modifies a lease, particularly in connection with securing new space. Many companies are investing in real estate to accommodate growth or upgrade their facilities. It's not uncommon for this to require a lessee to negotiate an exit of existing space, with timing carefully planned to minimize disruption to their operations and to minimize overlapping rental costs. When a lessee changes any existing lease, it can have accounting implications. Let's assume that a lessee negotiates an early exit of a leased property. It's not uncommon for a lessor to agree to a shorter lease term in exchange for increasing the rents over that remaining period. Even when no explicit penalty has been agreed, a lessee should consider whether a penalty has actually been incurred. If the revised rents simply adjust lease payments to current market rates, it's unlikely that a penalty has been incurred. However, there are cases where rent increases represent an in-substance penalty, and such penalties must be expensed immediately. In addition to considering potential penalties, lessees must also consider their lease-related assets and liabilities. For example, management will need to adjust the amortization period of any leasehold improvements to match the shorter remaining lease term. Similarly, a lessee would typically adjust its amortization of any accrued or deferred rents so as to fully amortize them over the shortened lease term. What's even more challenging is when a lessor permits a lessee to end one lease but provides the lessee with replacement space. Since these arrangements are typically negotiated together, the economics of the two leases can be hard to separate. As such, any accrued or deferred rents from the first lease would be amortized prospectively over the new lease term. A lessee would also have to consider whether the rents for the replacement space include an in-substance termination penalty. Judgments required and should be based on the underlying economics of the two leases. A critical milestone in any lease arrangement is determining when the lease begins. Lease commencement is the date that control over the leased property transfers to the lessee and rent expense begins. This is not necessarily the date specified in the lease arrangement. It's based on when the lessee or its representatives obtain control of and responsibility for the asset. For real estate leases, it's not uncommon for a lessee to require tenant improvements in advance of opening to the public or beginning its operations. The improvements may be performed by the lessor, the lessee, or some combination of the two. Regardless of who does the work, it's important to consider the lessee's rights during that period to determine when control is passed and when the lease begins. If the lease starts before the space is complete, a lessee may be required to recognize rent expense on both the old space and the new space simultaneously. Incentives intended to offset some of the switching costs cannot be used to offset expenses on the old lease and would instead be recognized over the term of the new lease. This is the case even when the new lessor pays a lessee's rent obligations directly to the old landlord. When thinking about the model, it's important to note a lessee must recognize rent expense for any space that it controls.
Determining the length of the lease term is another important judgment. This will always include the non-cancelable portion of the lease, but will also include optional renewal periods that are reasonably assured of exercise. Reasonably assured is a high degree of probability. We generally think of this as being 75 to 80% likely to occur. So, while the bar is high, lessees must still perform a candid and robust assessment of penalties, or the quantitative and qualitative costs of not renewing. This analysis is based on facts and circumstances. However, the likelihood of including one or more lease renewals increases with the level of investment the lessee makes, and when such assets have a life that is significantly longer than the non-cancelable lease term. A lessee should exclude renewal periods absent evidence of a penalty. If a lessee cannot demonstrate that it would suffer a clear penalty by not renewing, it cannot make a policy election to include one or more renewal periods. One example of a penalty is a cash payment required in lieu of renewing the lease, but the notion of a penalty is broader than that. A lessee must consider qualitative factors that might compel it to continue to use the leased asset during an optional extension period. For example, a lessee will often install leasehold improvements. Frequently, these improvements outlive the non-cancelable lease term, and if a lessee were to move, it would not only lose the value of the existing improvements, but would also have to invest in improvements to its new space. Accordingly, management must decide if the expected value of the improvements at the end of the initial lease term would be so significant as to compel them to remain. All relevant factors should be considered, including requirements to refresh a location or incentives offered by a replacement lessor to offset these costs. Another important consideration is the uniqueness of a leased property to a lessee's needs. The more unique the space is to a lessee's operations, or the more difficult it could be to find a suitable alternative, the more likely a lessee would be to renew the lease. Penalties are as unique as the space being leased, and the objective is to take a holistic view of all the consequences, whether direct or indirect, when assessing lease term. Lessees are understandably concerned about proposed changes to lease accounting. However, there's a good deal of complexity in applying today's guidance, and in light of current demand for space to accommodate future growth, it's an area that we expect companies to be focused on for the foreseeable future. For more information about these topics, please visit cfodirect.com. Thank you.